Good morning, everybody. Happy Monday. Happy first morning of Karl Barth Conference 2025. My name's Camber Herrig, and I just graduated from Duke Divinity School, where I had the opportunity to learn from our morning speaker this morning. And just like Karl Barth, our speaker this morning has lived out and researched, reflected, and written on a theology that is continuously impacted by experiences. The Reverend Dr. Sarah Jobe is co-director of the Prison Studies program at Duke Divinity School, and she co-founded Project Turn 15 years ago, which is seminary courses taught on-site in a local prison. Throughout the last 15 years, Jobe has been coordinating, observing, and teaching in prisons as a faculty member with Duke Divinity School, and where most recently she worked as a clinical chaplain at a women's prison in North Carolina.
Good morning. My name is Shirley Grandy, and I was formerly incarcerated. I served out my prison sentence under the leadership of Chaplain Jobe, Reverend Dr. Chaplain Jobe. I still call her Chap. And I was involved in the Turn program, Project Turn with Duke Divinity. Turn stands for Transform, Unlock, Renew. And it was, my first class was during COVID 2020, spring semester. And it was during that class that I was transformed, I was renewed, and my purpose and my voice were unlocked. I was afforded the opportunity to work with Chaplain Jobe and also other students and residents in the facility. I was able to learn alongside Duke grad students. Once I was released from incarceration, 2 years ago, actually, I applied to Duke Divinity School. I just completed my first year as an MDiv, and I actually took my very first Turn class, Project Turn class, as a seminary student, as opposed to a resident of incarceration. In that class, there were about 10 Duke students and approximately 15 residents of the women's prison. And alongside that, we studied Karl Barth. And one of the things that Chaplain Jobe, who taught the class, helped us to understand was that God shows up in forsaken places, the places of prison where people don't go. So that makes it, there are no unforsaken places. There are no God unforsaken places, because God is with us always. And I am so excited to have learned with Chaplain Jobe and studied Karl Barth.
During this class, Chaplain Jobe asked each of us to trouble what we thought we knew about Jesus and how he shows up and what his life and death means in the carceral system. And it was Karl who served as a conversation partner alongside these stories of incarceration of Jesus Christ. Barth knew a thing or two about how lived experiences change and shape us, and it changes our beliefs and faith. And for some of us, that catalyst moment is entering prison, whether as a resident, a volunteer, or as a prison chaplain. Friends, would you welcome me in joining Dr. Reverend Sarah Jobe?
Good morning. So you are holding in your hands 6 different stories of carceral death, prison death. In these 6 stories, you only have one. You each have one. That's how many I thought you could handle on Monday morning. But in these 6 stories, they're scattered around the room. 59 people die. These stories come from a 3-year collaborative ethnography that I conducted with prison chaplains across the United States from 2020 to 2023. And they're recounted in a book that will be released this September called No God-Forsaken Place, Prison Chaplaincy, Karl Barth, and Practicing Life in Prison. One of the biggest surprises of this study, of sitting and talking with prison chaplains from around the country, was how much death chaplains eyewitness. That was the thing that I had not expected. And as those deaths started to pile up, I had thought that in the pages of that book, I would recount every death that had been told to me. It seemed important to put down on paper, to memorialize These deaths that chaplains were being brave to say that they had seen. But as I sat down to sort through the data, I am a hand coder, as if I lived in 1920. So when I literally sat down with paper on the floor to code these deaths, the data overwhelmed. I could not write them all. And so I started sorting them into piles according to the type of death, and 6 types of carceral death emerged in this study: the suicides of prison staff, the suicides of incarcerated people, murders that occur in prison, whether against residents or staff, the deaths of incarcerated people's loved ones on the outside, and then how that reaches into the inside almost every day, executions, and mass deaths due to COVID. So why are chaplains' memories of carceral death scattered around this room of a Barth conference? Well, Barth was a justice-involved theologian. So Barth was a person, when I say that, I mean Barth is a person with a criminal record and a person who spent significant time behind bars as both a volunteer prison preacher and volunteer prison chaplain. He volunteered at Strafanstalt Schall and Motley, more commonly known as Basel Prison in Basel, Switzerland. So his own record: in 1934, in April, Barth was detained by the Nazi government and put through a 3-hour interrogation by the Gestapo. At that time, Barth was released from custody without formal charges. And that began a year of interactions with the German courts and German police that ended in June of 1935, when Barth was ultimately found guilty of crimes against the state, fined 1/5 of his annual salary, and dismissed from his teaching post by the Minister of Cultural Affairs. 20 years after his own experiences with the police and courts and the criminal justice system, 20 years after that, in a different country, in August of 1954, Barth agreed to the invitation of Chaplain Martin Schwartz to preach just one sermon. This is how it was billed, just one sermon. And that turned into 9 years of prison ministry, in which Barth preached 27 services at Basel Prison, 18 of which fell on liturgical holidays. So he spent his Christmases and Easters and Good Fridays there. Barth was not only a relief preacher. So many of us know his 2 volumes of sermons, which we have because the men at Basel Prison typeset those for us, and they actually published internally the first copies of those sermons. This pulpit is the very pulpit that Barth would preach from at Basel Prison. So it has traveled a long way to live here at Princeton in the Barth Center. And I am honored, I know people said this last night, to get to be behind it. But he wasn't just a prison preacher. So he came to jokingly refer to himself as the vicar of Spiegelstrasse, the street on which the prison was located. Chaplain Schwartz, the sort of supervising chaplain there, documents that Barth led discussion groups at the prison on weekday evenings. He did one-on-one visitation and pastoral care with people serving long sentences, especially during vacation seasons when Schwartz was out. And he even wrote those up in case notes that he gave to Chaplain Schwartz, so Schwartz would know what had gone on while he was gone. So in many ways, I do not think it is too much to say that Barth served as a volunteer prison chaplain. He was ordained as a Swiss Reformed pastor, and he began his career in parish ministry. But for the last 15 years of his life, he exercised his ministerial vocation primarily in prison. So Barth was a prison chaplain. That's one reason these stories are scattered around the room. But more importantly, I have filled this room with stories of carceral death because Christians confess that the salvation of the cosmos happens inside of a set of carceral deaths. Jesus is executed. Jesus has allegedly claimed Jewish kingship, and the charge displayed at his execution translates to something like treason or sedition, Matthew 27:37. 2 men are executed with him who have been found guilty of either robbery or rebellion. The word can be translated thieves, but also indicates rebels in other places in Scripture where it's used of both Jesus and Barabbas. Matthew, I'm honestly, there are so many citations in this that I'm going to go light on saying them out loud, or we will be here until like 13 additional people's talks. But I am happy to send this to anyone so that you can grab all the citations. Judas in this story dies by suicide. So Matthew's gospel reports that, this is my translation, quote, when Judas, who had him arrested, saw that he was condemned, he was filled with regret. Judas attempts to return the money that he's received for giving up Jesus's location. He regrets his paid participation in the arrest and execution of Jesus, and Judas hangs himself. Jesus's carceral death has always been flanked by two other executions and the suicide of a person who felt complicit in his execution. In our time together today, I want to remember Jesus's death in this original context of wider carceral death. I want to invite you to join me and Karl Barth in our intuition that replacing Jesus's death alongside other carceral deaths is indeed where one finds anything salvific at all about how prisons kill. And that setting these carceral deaths alongside the carceral death of Jesus might just be a, quote, dying alongside, those are Barth's words, that Barth calls the first Christian community. So I want to invite you to turn your attention to the story of death that you were invited to sit with and keep watch with. Part of why you only have one, it wasn't a joke, is that I really actually think you can only deal with one. And those of you who are online, there's a PDF that's posted. And so you have access to all 6, but I would also strongly encourage you to pick one to sit with. But just take a look at that. And we're not going to tell each of these stories. But again, in this room, there's a story of officer suicide. There's a story of an incarcerated person's suicide. There's a story of executions. There's a story of mass death by COVID. There's a story of a death of a loved one. And there's a story of a violent death inside. So in the context of these snippets of phrases and your one story that you have been gifted, I want to invite you to hear a full account of one execution. The room they do it in, they call it the skull. He was offered something to dull the pain, but he didn't take it. And they executed him. Divided up his clothes after, drew straws for who would get them. It was 9 a.m. on Friday morning when they executed him. The official charge was treason. They executed him with 2 people charged with felony larceny all at once. And everyone was making fun of him, insulting him, acting like if he could do such great things, he should have saved himself from execution. Even the chaplains and the lawyers joined in. I remember they said he saved others, but he can't save himself. Even the people executed with him said those things. It was noon when the sky just got dark. For 3 hours. It was dark until 3 p.m. And at 3 p.m., he cried out so loud in our native language, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Most of the people there didn't know what he was saying. They just kept watching, waiting. Someone tried to give him something to drink, but that guy was told to step back, told not to interfere. Jesus screamed out his last breath. A paraphrase from the Gospel of Mark. What could this execution possibly have to do with the salvation of the world? Or put even more starkly, as Barth does in Church Dogmatics 4:1, how is it that, quote, the will of God was done as the will of Satan was done? The action of God was identical with the action of Satan. That was the frightful thing, end quote. Today, I want to explore Barth's answer to that question. The question of how does the cross save? It's the question of atonement that was asked last night, the question of soteriology or salvation. And I want to explore two of Barth's answers, not just one, because Barth gives two slightly different answers when he is writing to what I think he presumes is a predominantly free audience in church dogmatics than he gives when he is preaching the Good Friday sermon inside of Basel prison. And some of you have heard me argue before that Barth's theology changes over time as he gets more involved in prison and has more prison experience. And I do believe that. So I do think Barth's Jesus starts to look more and more like an incarcerated person, that Barth takes more and more seriously Jesus's court experience, his guilty verdict, his execution as execution and not just something called cross that we don't practice anymore today. I do think those are true, but that is a different lecture. Today, I want to do something different, which is I want to look at things that were written at the same time. So we're going to look at two passages from the Doctrine of Reconciliation. Specifically, I want to treat a section that occurs at the end of the judge in paragraph 59.2. So this is a section on the cross. That's what we're focusing in on. And then near the end of the Doctrine of Reconciliation in CD 432, a section called The Christian in Affliction. But between writing these two passages, he preaches this sermon. So all of this is going on at the same time. He preaches the Good Friday sermon in 1957. And so today, what I want us to think about and look at, these theologies, they're not incompatible, but they are different. His answer to how does execution save is different when he is talking to free people than when he is talking to people behind bars. And I think that we might learn some general thing about like the way theology is shaped by its context. I don't know if that's kind of boring at this point. But specifically, I think we might learn how prison clarifies the cross. And how if what you want to say about the cross does not hold water when you are looking at people who have been condemned to death, that it's possible that what you're saying about the cross doesn't hold water at all. That's what we're going to do today. All right, so let's jump in. We're going to start with church dogmatics. And while it takes him hundreds of pages to say it, classically, I actually think Barth's Doctrine of Reconciliation is quite simple and elegant. And the way that I would put it is that Jesus takes up the worst of the human condition and brings the fullness of his holiness into the fullness of creaturely horror, thereby hallowing the horrific. Barth understands Jesus' death by execution to be the ultimate instantiation of this. So this is not something he sees Jesus only doing on the cross. He sees him doing it all throughout his life. But at the cross, Jesus goes all the way down with humans to the point of death. Jesus takes up the very places and experiences that we call God forsaken, those places and experiences that have the power to separate human beings from God. Barth calls this eternal death. So there's death, but then there's eternal death, which is separation from God. And this is what he thinks Jesus inhabits on the cross. That Jesus inhabits separation from God as God, thereby vacating even death as a site of separation from the divine. So Barth takes dead serious that when Jesus cries out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" that he is actually entering a site of God forsakenness. This is not hyperbole. This is not poetry. This is not some example of Jesus's humanity and emotionalism mistaking something that's actually quite fine for God forsakenness. No, indeed. When Jesus says, "God, why have you forsaken me?" Barth takes him dead serious. And he hangs the system on it. That by entering God forsakenness with the fullness of his divinity, that sight and experience will never be God forsaken for anyone else again. In the words of one of the chaplains in this study, because of Jesus's presence in death, there is no God forsaken place, no God forsaken person. Even death is no longer God forsaken because God has been in it. I want to highlight 2 points about this that I think are important in the way that Barth unpacks it. So first, and it's kind of obvious at face value, but I don't know, we don't say it very much. In this economy of salvation, state-sponsored execution is the ultimate instantiation of God forsakenness. When God wants to be with humans in the depths of their horror and vacate horror with God's holiness, God does that by entering into a court system that calls punishment an act of justice and killing people found guilty justifiable. And Barth does not just name execution specifically as God forsaken. So this isn't just about the death penalty. He calls arrest the work of Satan. So I want to read this longer quote. He's talking about Gethsemane, writ more broadly, Gethsemane, the site of Jesus' arrest. And he named that the frightful thing about this story, you're going to hear these words again, is that the will of God was done as the will of Satan was done. That the action of God was identical with the action of Satan. That was the frightful thing. This quote continues, "The coincidence of the divine and satanic will and work was the problem of this hour, the darkness in which Jesus addressed God in Gethsemane." At the end of this part of church dogmatics, according to Barth, and he says this repeatedly, Gethsemane is satanic and Golgotha is God forsaken. Gethsemane, the site of Jesus' arrest, Golgotha, the site of his execution. Throughout these sections of church dogmatics, they become a sort of refrain. Barth calls Jesus the victor of Gethsemane and Golgotha, or the afflicted of Gethsemane and Golgotha. These bookended sites come to serve as shorthand for the whole of Jesus's criminal justice experience, from arrest all the way through to execution. There is an inherent critique of a criminal justice system that begins in arrest and receives carceral death as an acceptable end when it is pinpointed as the worst of the human condition into which God enters. Barth says that God willingly became a victim of that system in order to, quote, release man from a legal relationship fatal to him, from an intolerable commitment which he has accepted, from an imprisonment in which he finds himself, end quote. Salvation happens internal to a set of carceral deaths because carceral death either is or is at least representative of the ultimate horror from which humans need saving. When Jesus enters carceral death, he doesn't condone it. He suffers the worst of it. And by his divine presence as an executed person, he both unmasks and vacates execution as a site of God forsakenness. I'm going to say that one more time. He both unmasks execution as a site of God forsakenness. We're not supposed to forget that part. And vacates execution as a site of God forsakenness. Secondly, the second thing I want us to notice, and this is jumping apart to the part in the doctrine of reconciliation that talks about like how we get involved, because, not often, but occasionally Barth does talk about how we get involved. So while Jesus takes away the power of death as a sign of separation from God, he does not abolish death. He does not abolish execution. Don't you wish he did? Don't you? Can't tell you how much I'm like laying in my bed just like, if we could have done it a different way. He doesn't abolish carceral death. He doesn't abolish death. He doesn't abolish execution. Indeed, instead, Christians have an inescapable mandate to, quote, take up the cross, to follow Jesus, quote, both into prison and into death. That's Barth. The call to follow Jesus does not stop at the foot of the cross with the work of witnessing. That is an important part of the work. There are whole sections of church dogmatics on the witness and on witnessing, but it does not stop there. The Christian must inhabit a, quote, unavoidable fellowship with the crucified. Barth is very clear that when Christians take up the cross, it is not to make the cross efficacious, but rather to represent what Jesus has already accomplished. So he says things like, quote, Christians suffer something corresponding in their little passions as a reflection and a likeness of his great passion. Or they, quote, bear the stamp of the crucified as a, quote, analogy and reflection. He sometimes even calls Christian passions not taking up the cross, but rather taking up the shadow of the cross. In calling the Christian inhabitation of the cross a reflection, an analogy, a shadow, Barth is saying that humans are both like and unlike Jesus when they inhabit the part of salvation where God dies. Humans are like Jesus when they inhabit the cross, in that they, like Jesus, this is Barth's answer, cannot presume to be saved from death. So this is very important to Barth, that Jesus does not go into death presuming to be saved from it, and that none of us are promised salvation from death. That is not the promise on offer. Very important. Barth acknowledges that solidarity with other people to the point of death has some serious risks and temptations, both for Jesus and for those who would follow after him. And one of those temptations is to risk death with the sure knowledge that you will be saved. Barth sees this enacted in the final temptation of Christ in the wilderness, when Satan suggests that Jesus take a headlong plunge into death to prove that God and God's angels will protect him. He says this would not be a godly death because it presumes salvation, and Jesus refuses that kind of death. But Barth is also clear that Christians and Jesus do not choose death. So it's not just that you're not going into it thinking you'll be saved. You're not actually choosing it at all. He says you don't choose it with despair. You don't choose it with sure knowledge. You don't choose it for your own religious self-glorification. You don't choose it at all. Rather, Christians like Jesus risk death for the sake of community with those who are most impacted by the systems of death in this world. This is an important difference. We do not choose death, we risk death for the sake of community with those who are most impacted by it. Which brings one to how humans are not like Jesus in their little passions. Humans are not like Jesus in that they are promised that even in carceral death, they will never be separated from God. That's the thing that Jesus has done away with, is separation from God, even at something like an execution. The Christian must realize that after Jesus has inhabited death, no one will ever experience death as Jesus experienced it, as forsaken. That's the thing that only Jesus does. That after Jesus brought his divine life into death, death can never be a site of separation from God again. And so Barth's clear that Christians must acknowledge this difference in their descriptions of what they're doing in order to, quote, avoid wild exaggeration about the extent to which they can image Jesus in death. The mystery of how salvation occurs in death is bound up with the fact that Jesus is both God and human being, that Jesus, as both divine and human, vacates death as a site of separation from God by placing his divine life into it. So that's Barth's answer for how carceral death is salvific when he is speaking to a predominantly free audience. I like it. Don't hear me as coming down on not liking it. Okay, I like it. And of note, to the question that was already asked last night, it is an alternative to penal substitutionary atonement. It's still penal because that's where it happens. But the words have been put together in a different order, and that does matter. But when he preaches Jesus' death inside of prison, the dynamics of salvation change in a few important ways. So in 1957, Barth preaches the Good Friday service at Basel Prison. At this point, he's been visiting and preaching at that prison for 3 years. And he takes as his text Luke 23:33, and specifically just the phrase, "and the criminals with him." His opening words prefigure many of the major moves of the sermon, and especially because we're here in this pulpit, I would like us to actually just hear that first opening sort of set of words so that you can start to get a feel for this sermon that Barth preached. So whatever you have to do to nerd out and believe that you're in Basel prison with this very fancy background, do that. Maybe you have to close your eyes. But to hear Chaplain Barth say, "They crucified him with the criminals." Which is more amazing, to find Jesus in such bad company or to find the criminals in such good company? As a matter of fact, both are true. And one thing is certain, here they hang, all three, Jesus and the criminals, one at the right, one at the left, all three exposed to the same public abuse, to the same interminable pain, to the same low and irrevocable death throes. Like Jesus, these two criminals have been arrested somewhere, locked up and sentenced by some judge in the course of the previous few days. And now they hang on their crosses with him, and they find themselves in solidarity and fellowship with him. They are linked in a common bondage, never to be broken, just as the nails that fastened them to the piece of wood would never break. It was as inescapable for them as it was for him. It was a point of no return for them as it was for him. There remained only the shameful, pain-stricken present and future of their approaching death. Strangely enough, there's many paintings of Jesus' crucifixion where the two criminals are lost to sight. It would perhaps be more appropriate not to represent Jesus' death at all. But if done, then these two thieves on the right and the left must not be left out. In any painting or representation where they are absent, an important, even essential element is missing. They crucified him with the criminal. Do you know what this implies? Don't be too surprised if I tell you that this was the first Christian fellowship, the first indissoluble, certain, and indestructible Christian community. So I'll stop there. The two people executed with Jesus are important, even essential. They are the first indissoluble, indestructible, and certain Christian community. Their suffering with Jesus is an indispensable part of Jesus' suffering, such that Jesus' death should not be represented without their dying alongside of his. So as Barth opens this sermon, he stresses that Jesus is the same as the men executed with him. They're experiencing the same things. They've been through the same things. They're bound together in this. They've been criminalized in the same way. Barth will take an interlude. I don't want to be caught telling a lie. Barth is going to take like 2 paragraphs in the middle of this sermon to explain the way that Jesus' divinity made his death efficacious for others. And when he does that, i.e., how Jesus is different, he's going to sound a lot like he sounds in the passages I just explored in church dogmatics. But it's like 2 paragraphs, y'all. And then he's going to turn his attention back to the 3 men executed together for the remainder of the sermon. He's going to explain that in dying alongside Jesus, quote, no one before and no one after has ever witnessed so directly and so closely God's act of reconciliation, God's glory, or the redemption of the world as these 2 thieves, end quote. As they become the first and most intimate witnesses of Jesus' work of reconciliation, Barth says that these 2 men come to occupy a prioritized place in the kingdom of God. They outrank the disciples. If anyone wants to draw near to Jesus, they must get in line behind. So as someone who worked in prisons for 15 years, like, it's just masterful. There's this whole litany of like, get in line behind, get in line behind. And you think about the way that he's talking to folks who spend more time waiting than doing anything besides waiting. So there's this beautiful image of the way that all of us have to get in line behind these 2 men executed with Jesus. There's 2 important shifts happening in Barth's theology. One that he names aloud in the sermon and one that he does not. So the first shift that he names aloud is that salvation is no longer about belief, but about suffering alongside Jesus. So basing his claim on Romans 6:8, Barth proclaims, but if we have died with Christ, we believe that we shall also live with him. Because both of these men died with Christ, both will ascend to heaven with him. They become the first Christian community, not through belief, but through carceral death. Barth says, quote, now these 2 thieves have literally died with Christ, and theirs was the assurance that they would also literally live with him, end quote. Barth acknowledges that only one of these men is said to have confessed the truth about who Jesus is. The other died alongside Jesus, but remained resistant to the truth of who Jesus was. So he says this out loud. He's not trying to pretend like he doesn't know what the word says. And Barth acknowledges this difference and insists that the promise of life extends to both executed men. So let's listen. This is a long quote. Did they accept this miracle? Understand it? Believe it? Let's leave this question open. This much is certain, that the promise was meant for them, that they were covered by the promise, that they received it and possessed it, that they were allowed to suffer and die with him. This promise is given and is valid wherever men may suffer and die as criminals with Jesus. This promise and nothing else constitutes the Christian community and makes a man a Christian. These criminals were the first 2 whose suffering and dying with Jesus were gathered by this promise into the Christian fold. The Christian community, this is me now, it's constituted only by the fact that if one dies with Christ, one will live with him. Barth says the promise is, quote, given and valid at every carceral death. That's crazy. While extending salvation to all who die a criminalized death is startling, perhaps even more startling is the sense in the sermon that Jesus does not die alone. Did y'all notice? That's kind of like the whole deal in church dogmatics, like the linchpin, that Jesus vacates God-forsakenness by going into it with the fullness of his divinity. That's what makes Jesus' death different than others. No one else can ever die a death like Jesus because God is now in death But if the Jesus in this sermon is still God-forsaken, and it is not clear that he is not forsaken by other incarcerated men. He does not die alone. Barth makes much of the fact, in both church dogmatics and in this sermon, that Jesus' disciples did not stay with him at either Gethsemane or Golgotha. When arrest and execution are on the table, they're out of town. But here, Barth says that the two men executed with Jesus kept vigil with him in a way that his disciples could not. This is another long quote. In this hour, they could not abandon him. They could not sleep. Willing or not, they were forced to watch with him many long hours on the cross. Nor could they escape his dangerous company. They could not very well deny him, being publicly exposed as his companion. This is how they were the first Christian community. He and they and he were bound together, were not and are not to be separated in all eternity. End quote. He and they and he were bound together, were not and are not to be separated through all eternity. Through state-sponsored execution. Barth explains the radical and efficacious implications of bound togetherness for the two men executed with Jesus. He does this in the sermon. He wants us to know that their bound togetherness with Jesus does these eternal workings for them. He does not take up the fact that the bound togetherness might also have radical implications for Jesus himself. In church dogmatics, Jesus enters into unshakable solidarity with human beings in his death. Here, these two men enter into unshakable solidarity with Jesus in their deaths. It's almost as if the two thieves are Jesus for Jesus. If the work of the cross is to overcome the separation of God and human beings, even at the point of death, and Jesus accomplishes that by bringing his divine life into human death, these two men bring their human lives into Jesus's divine death so that he too does not die alone. Embedded in the story of salvation is the salvation of the Savior. The Savior's saviors are also arrested, tried, and executed men. They stand with Jesus to the very end in a way his disciples did not and could not. They are an enduring witness that Jesus is not alone, even in death, just as Jesus accomplishes that same work for the cosmos. Carceral death is not salvific. It remains God-forsaken. But salvation can be found in it through the witness of those who risk themselves to die alongside those whom the state targets. Salvation lies in one's willingness to draw near to carceral death, to inhabit in one's person the gospel truth that there is no God-forsaken place and no God-forsaken person. We are invited to inhabit salvation. Does it still sound like good news? Or maybe we don't know. Maybe it's not. But we are invited nonetheless to inhabit salvation. And I want to close by circling back to the stories of carceral death that are scattered around the room, because I see these stories of carceral death inhabiting salvation in this corporate way. The deaths are not salvific. They're needless, horrific, insupportable destructions of human life. But when the chaplains in this study take those carceral deaths up, when they stand in and with them, when we recollect them alongside the carceral death of Jesus, perhaps we are beginning to inhabit the ark of salvation together. So some of you read about 19 men who were executed. They are an icon to the executed Christ. And the chaplain in that story, Chaplain Harold, stands at their executions as an embodiment of the truth that executions are not God-forsaken, that no one dies alone. The little boy, some of you read a story about a little boy who was shot. He is, in a very straightforward way, the son who was killed. And his incarcerated father and the chaplain grieve the loss of him together and remember him after his death. They are together inhabiting the ark of salvation. Some of you read a story about an incarcerated man who dives over the railing of a 5-story cell block. He inhabits the full horror of human desperation. He is an icon to the full horror of what we do to each other. Incarcerated man who cleans his splattered remains up off the floor after his death, bearing witness to the God who keeps living in the face of horror. In this economy of salvation, chaplains are not always representing the divine, and incarcerated people are not always representing the human. That is not how salvation works. It is much more gloriously and beautifully messy than all of that linear hierarchy. Sometimes in the stories that I collected, the chaplain's life ends, and it's folks who are incarcerated whose lives keep going and keep bearing witness. The roles move back and forth. The toll of prison is not just taken on people who are incarcerated. So the roles move back and forth as the toll that prison takes sometimes falls on incarcerated people, sometimes on staff, sometimes on the communities around them who love the people in these systems. Carceral death is, at every level, more than any one human body can hold. We can only ever inhabit salvation, represent the divine and human Jesus at the moment of his carceral death together as a community. Some still living stand as witness to the God whose life draws into death and stays alive in the face of it. Some dying in prison stand as an embodied witness to the depths of human horror and the truth that sinful systems are indeed always barreling towards death. No human being can live and die simultaneously the way that Jesus can when the fullness of his divinity descends to hell. So in the logic of church dogmatics, we can only ever inhabit the salvific nature of Christ's death as a community because Jesus is the only one among us who is both human and divine. And any given one of us will only be able to represent one part of that horrific death or enduring life at any given time. We will always need someone alongside us to represent the other half of the mystery of salvation. But in Barth's prison preaching, we can only ever inhabit the salvific nature of Christ's death as a community because it was only ever salvific in community to begin with. Death was vacated as a site of God-forsakenness when Jesus kept watch with 2 incarcerated men as they kept watch with him until he screamed out his last breath. That is the mystery of salvation. Thank you.